Hello and welcome to the Big Technology Podcast, a show for cool-headed, nuanced conversation of the tech world and beyond. Joining us today is the author of The Devil's Playbook, a new book about the rise and fall of Juul, the sleek electronic cigarettes your kids have probably hit. She's also a reporter at Bloomberg News. Lauren Etter, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Alex.
Great having you here. I don't know why, maybe because I've covered Facebook for a long time, but I have a real interest in vice and addiction. And so I saw that your book was coming out. It's just out and couldn't wait to dive into it. And it's a fantastic book. So thank you for writing it. But what's interesting about your book is, you write about two Stanford kids taking on a big, bad industry, one that harms people, who see the need to disrupt it and take it down with a less harmful solution. And, typically that's a tale of Silicon Valley heroism. And we celebrate that out here. But this one's a little different. So why is that?
So, the first thing to say, just a short answer to your question, is because it's tobacco. They could have chosen any industry to innovate on, and they chose perhaps the most controversial one. Mm-hmm. Tobacco has a very long and sordid history in America, and it's one that's extremely controversial. We made it through the tobacco wars in the 1990s. The tobacco industry was near bankruptcy, and they touched a nerve like no other when, there was this long history of deceit and lying to the American public about the addictive and deadly nature of their product. They embarked on one of the most consequential and large disinformation campaigns about their product.
The cigarette makers,
absolutely.
Right. And so these two guys make sort of the alternative to that, which is a very appealing e-cigarette, kind of looks like a USB drive. And why don't you keep going? But it is interesting how they see that there's this cancer-causing product. You write even that most of the damage is done by the actual lighting of the cigarette. It's not the tobacco; it's the actual flame and the combustion. And so this is supposed to be a safer alternative, but it goes off the rails a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the most fascinating things. This is one of the most deadly products that remains on the market today that's considered to be legal. And
the
cigarette, sorry. Yeah, we should absolutely, we're talking about the cigarette right now. Mm-hmm. The cigarette is one of the most deadly products. It contributes, causes or is the most leading cause of preventable death in America, contributes to the death of 400 and almost 500,000 people every year. So why not innovate on this product?
A COVID each year. Yeah.
Yes. A COVID each year. It's a really interesting statistic. So absolutely, it seemed like it was absolutely ripe for innovation. This is what Silicon Valley does. They look for products that haven't been innovated on, gaps in markets, that type of thing. And this is absolutely a product that had not been innovated on in more than a century. It was essentially paper, shredded tobacco leaf. You light it on fire, just like Christopher Columbus witnessed, back in the day, and you inhale it into your lungs. So there had been no innovation. So of course, Adam Bowen and James Monsees, the co-founders of Juul, realized that there was a big gap in the market and decided to try innovating on that.
Right. And then Silicon Valley folks also go out looking for problems and try to find ways that they can solve it using technology. So
yes,
they had the cigarette obviously hadn't been changed in a long time. I mean, of course, the tobacco companies had played with it. Maybe it's a lighter, drag or a more nicotine heavy drag or different flavors like a menthol or something like that. But they were in the Stanford design lab and basically said, no one's touched this yet, and thought that they could design something better. And it's interesting, like through the book, the Juul, and I mean, I feel like if you've been breathing in the last 3 or 4 years, you've seen, the Juul out in public, but it is cool. It's sleekly designed. It looks like this USB. It hits pretty well, and it started out with 5% nicotine, which is more. Well, yeah, actually, this is a good moment to pause. So we talk about cigarettes. There's tobacco. There's nicotine. Throughout the book, there's this theme that actually it's nicotine that's the substance that's really so addicting. So I want to hear a little bit more, just like, let's talk about baseline, because so often we talk about these things. We don't go into depth about them. There's just typically a top line, cigarettes are bad, tobacco is bad, combining everything, the paper, the tar, the leaf, the nicotine together. But I'd like to hear your perspective first about, what is it about nicotine, that's so addictive, and what's actually the harmful part of these products?
Yeah, I mean, this is really one of the most interesting aspects of this product and this debate, which is that I'm so sorry. Um, I think we're having my husband is coming in here, the kids perhaps. Okay, sorry about that.
No worries.
Hopefully we can edit that out.
Yeah.
So that's one of the most interesting aspects of this product and of this debate is that actually it's not the nicotine that kills Americans. It kills 480,000 Americans every single year. It's a combustion of the tobacco leaf. So nicotine taken by itself is not necessarily harmful. There are studies that show that it can contribute to heart disease. It can there's nothing that shows that it can actually contribute to lung disease, that type of thing. The actual thing that causes lung disease is a cigarette. So nicotine by itself, the proponents of the products will say it's just like caffeine, or it's just like any other kind of enjoyable product that might give you like a little bit of a high or something like that. But the biggest problem with nicotine is that it's highly addictive. It's as addictive as heroin. And, when you're a teenager, when your brain is not fully developed, so the youth brain does not become fully developed until the age of 25. So studies show that it can interfere with the development of your brain and cause harms down the road in terms of judgment and that type of thing. So we're really talking about youth addiction and whether or not, I mean, really what you're getting at is a super important question about why do we care if there are millions of Americans addicted to nicotine? Like, who cares? We have
That is the
millions
question.
right.
Yeah. Especially
And
if it's not going to harm them to the point that a cigarette is. And that, I think, is the case that Juul and its proponents make. And in fact, what Philip Morris and I guess later named Altria was trying to make, which is that they're going to do this reduced harm cigarette, get off our backs.
Right. And the most fascinating part of that with the tobacco industry is that for years they said, no, it's not the nicotine that keeps people smoking. It's the enjoyable factor of a cigarette. And they denied for so many years that it was the nicotine, that nicotine was even addictive. Of course, we have this epic kind of historical moment in front of Congress in 1994, 1996, where all of the CEOs of the tobacco industry, the 7 CEOs, sat before Congress and held up their right hands and said that they believed that nicotine was not addictive. They were splitting hairs there, but they did say that. And so for so many years, they denied that. And suddenly the industry is saying, okay, well, no, we all agree that nicotine is addictive. And let's just kind of focus on the nicotine now. So it's a huge kind of 180 in terms of the public policy and thinking about this type of product.
And
But
it paves the way for e-cigarettes.
Paves the way for e-cigarettes.
Yeah.
Because suddenly you have people talking about, okay, well, cigarettes are deadly. It's the combustion that kills people. It's not the nicotine. And why don't we just take away the combustion? And if Americans want nicotine so badly, let's just give them what they want and allow them to have it. So what's the big deal?
Yeah. And nicotine, I think that a lot of the ways that the cigarette companies describe it is that it's satisfying, right?
Yes.
Is the chemical that satisfies, brings a calm over somebody, but then as it, you inhale it through your lungs because that's the fastest way to deliver it into your system. But as it dissipates, it leaves you wanting more pretty badly.
Exactly. It is. It's highly addictive. It begins a cycle where your brain releases these neurotransmitters and dopamine, and actually the cigarette and nicotine actually contribute to lots of things. It's like it can relax you. It can give you make you alert. It
Focus.
can focus.
Make you feel cool.
It can make you feel cool. It can give you that little buzz. It can calm you. It has lots of different beneficial properties. There have even been studies showing that it can help with people who have Parkinson's disease. So there's a real reframing of what the problem is and how do we solve it. I mean, there's actually multiple threads to this that need to be dissected and talked about. But right now, just kind of fast forward a little bit, we can go back. But right now, the tobacco industry, including Altria, is very focused on correcting the misinformation about nicotine. They feel like there needs to be a re-education campaign, and they've actually asked the FDA to spend some of their fundraising dollars that they've spent on youth tobacco use in general and prevention to re-educating Americans about nicotine. Because the truth is, a lot of people are confused about nicotine. A substantial and kind of shocking amount of people believe that it's nicotine that kills you, when in fact it's not. It's a cigarette. It's a combustion. So
Yeah.
I think we're going to hear a lot more about nicotine, and certainly it's not going away anytime soon.
Yeah, and listeners, I swear we're going to get to the technology aspect of this in a moment, but it's important to set the backstory. So, having said what we've just talked about, tobacco, the combustion is the bad part. Nicotine is the addictive element to it, but coffee is addictive, and we have that legal. So, just briefly, what's the problem here then with having folks addicted to nicotine? If it is having these positive effects on people, the focus, the self-confidence and the satisfaction, what's the issue?
Right. I mean, I think you should think about it this way. It's like, what is the purpose of it? And also the fact, what is the purpose of having nicotine, and who's making money off of it? It always goes back to who's making money. And
Mm-hmm.
you have this gigantic industry that is predicated on people being addicted to their product and continuing to use it forever. So um, the problem really gets at the youth issue. Um, One of the most startling and I think sticking statistics is
Mm-hmm.
that 90% of adult smokers today began smoking before they were 18. 99% of them began smoking before the age of 25, of course, is when the your brain is fully matured. So you have people who are becoming addicted to a product when their brains aren't fully developed, and they become addicted to it for life. Let's say not all of them for life, but lots of them for life. And it's, you know, essentially inhaling something into your lungs. And if they didn't start when they were kids, they wouldn't start when they were adults. So essentially, the industry is basing its entire business model on the next generation of users. So I don't know. This is really a social kind of moral question
Yeah.
about whether or not we care, whether or not we care if, if there's a product that's not as deadly as a cigarette, if we care that they're using it. And I think the answer, at least in my mind right now, is that first of all, e-cigarettes are not proven to be safe. There's
Mm-hmm.
a lot of, there's a lot of research going on right now, but there have not been long-term clinical studies showing that e-cigarettes are safe, because at the end of the day, and the anti e-cigarette, anti-vape people will point this out, like the lungs were designed to breathe air and nothing else. And
Mm-hmm.
so you're essentially, while you're not inhaling a fire burning product, smoke, you are inhaling a vapor, or actually an aerosol, which contains propylene glycol, vegetable glycerin, lots of flavoring compounds that have subcompounds, and lots of different things that when you heat them up, they can create potentially cancer causing chemicals like aldehydes and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
There just haven't been a long enough studies. So when you look back at the cigarette industry and you see how for so many years they obfuscated and lied about the nature of their product, it took a generation to show that there were lung cancer, that there was cancer developed from the cigarette. So it begs the question of whether or not in a generation we're going to see vapors have some sort of lung disease. I'm not
Yeah.
trying to be an alarmist.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not trying to be in that camp that says like, oh my God, this is like the worst thing in the whole world. But like, there are a lot of unknowns. And it begs the question of whether or not the FDA endorses a product that hasn't been fully studied and is like on the market for people to be using. So,
Yeah.
especially for kids. So I think there are lots of important questions, but yeah, nicotine, it's I think there's still kind of an open question about why do we care? I think we care. I think most people would say, we don't really want our kids being addicted to anything, especially a
Right.
highly addictive product like nicotine.
Yeah, and what struck me in the book is that Scott Gottlieb, who was running the FDA under Trump for some time, who you describe as libertarian, uh, even he was like, "We are not going to have an epidemic of youth smoking under my watch, or youth nicotine addiction under my watch." And it turns out that's what happened. So,
Yeah, exactly.
but
Scott
like when
Gottlieb.
when
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
libertarian is saying the government should step in and do something, that's when you sort of know, okay, maybe this is something that we should be focused on here, and there
Yeah.
could be some harm.
Yeah. I mean, he was in a really difficult position. I
Hmm.
mean, there's kind of many dimensions to this, but and we can talk about that, but he ultimately saw what was happening. And, so after the tobacco wars in the 1990s, there had been this huge push, this huge youth prevention campaign to reduce the number of youth smokers.
And it
And
worked.
it worked. It had been going down, 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 and it had been at the lowest levels. And then e-cigarettes come in, and suddenly it starts ticking back up. And when Juul arrives on the market in the summer of 2015, it just like really picked up. So suddenly it was like, wait, we solved this epidemic. Oh, no, we didn't. Now there's this new product that's contributing to this new nicotine epidemic. And Scott Gottlieb did not want to be the person that oversaw the rise of this. I mean, of course, he did. He was that
Hmm.
person. But it was complicated for Scott Gottlieb. Like,
There were forces outside of his control, but I don't want to get too
yeah,
deep into the politics of that nature. But I do think that it
yeah,
was interesting that he came out, pretty stringently against and had this fiery kind of speech as one of his last actions as the head of the FDA. But I do want
yeah.
to get into. We talked a little bit, and I think the most compelling case against these things is the way that they do hook kids, teens and preteens. So, do you have any stats about how many kids were using Juul at its height? Because I think it's declined a little bit, but just give us a
Yes,
picture of how pervasive this was among young people, even a
right.
couple of years ago.
Yeah, so it basically reached more than 5 million kids, more than 5 million teens. High school and middle school students were using um, e-cigarettes. Now, that's not broken down by Juul, but most of them, or a high percentage of them, were Juul because Juul took off. So we have 5 million students who were using e-cigarettes slash Juul. Um, Over the past year, it did decline by about 1.3 million. So you still have like
Mm,
3 point some million
that are still on it.
that are still using it. It's something about the past 30 days they've used this product. So
Mm.
it's still millions of kids that are using it.
Yeah, and like super young kids also
Yes.
that are.
Yes. And that was kind of the shocking thing. It wasn't like 18-year-olds, 17-year-olds. It was like middle schoolers.
Mhm.
It was cascading through middle schools. So I think that was kind of the most alarming thing. It was just like, wait, is this really the solution to a bigger problem, which is about adult smokers essentially? And that's a
Yeah,
big
because
trade-off and the crux
that's
of
what
the issue.
right. That's what it was marketed as originally. That was the big, well, the marketing. We'll get into the marketing in a second.
Yeah.
But that was the initial, the dreamy Silicon Valley language is we're going to heal the
Yes.
world by being this thing that will take people off these cancer-causing cigarettes and put them onto Juul. So there
Correct.
was a moment where it did seem like Juul was going to take over the world, when those 5 million kids were using it and untold numbers of adults were as well. And now that doesn't seem to be the case. So what happened? Briefly.
Well, briefly, what happened is the FDA kind of stepped in. They ended up taking off some of the flavored products. So Juul used to be sold in, creme brulee and mint and fruit and that type of thing. The FDA said we're not going to allow these pod-based products to come in flavored products anymore. So right now you can only buy Juul in tobacco flavor and menthol flavor. So that was a huge, like, really took away a big percentage of their market
It
when you
it
could.
like really answers the question of whether those fun flavors actually were intended for kids. And I mean, once they took it off, the kids are off the market. That's very telling.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little more complicated than that. There were new products that were coming on the market, like Puff Bar, the single-use products
Mm,
that came in like pink lemonade and other flavors, and they actually were not subjected. I guess it proves your point, but they weren't subjected to the flavor regulation. So you
mm,
can still go out and buy pink
yeah.
lemonade flavored Puff Bar, for example. But so there was new competition in the market, but also I think there was that scare. People suddenly got scared by EVALI, which was the lung injury, chronic lung injury that
Yeah.
initially was
T-
tied to vaping.
right. To
Um,
your point, we don't know how this will actually impact our health in the long term, but we saw some really scary stuff in the short term where like previously healthy people were obliterating their lungs with vape machines,
right,
vapes.
and yeah,
Yeah.
vapes, and exactly, and this is like a flashpoint in the debate about e-cigarettes right now. The pro vaping crowd, they're very upset at the CDC
Mm,
for basically causing this panic over e-cigarettes. What happened was the product that was most directly contributing to the lung injuries was actually a bootlegged CBD product, like cannabis product.
Yeah, it
And
was
they were,
stuff people were getting. Well, anyway, sorry, go ahead.
oh
But it
no,
was
yeah,
weed. Yeah, at the
right,
end of the day,
right. It
even
was
if it doesn't
weed.
have the active ingredient, which is THC. But yeah,
Oh no, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean CBD. It was actually
yeah.
THC.
Oh, it
It
was.
did have the
All
active
right.
ingredient. They were getting
Yeah.
high. They
Uh,
were vaping the pods that contain THC with but the product on the market, they were cutting it with something called vitamin E oil, essentially, and that was what they found to be one of the leading contributing factors of that disease. So the anti or the pro vaping crowd, they're very upset at the CDC for not coming out sooner and saying it wasn't nicotine containing products. It wasn't Juul that was causing people to get this lung injury. It was actually these, bootleg black market products that were not, most people weren't using. The CDC has remained pretty cautious about
mhm.
this. They continue to say that there are a number of people who've come down with the lung injury who used nicotine containing products only. So it's still, I mean, while it's pretty certain that the lung injuries that we saw, the spate of lung injuries that we saw, were contributed by this or caused by this vitamin E acetate and the THC, the CDC has not ruled out that nicotine containing products contribute to this problem as well. So, the industry is not in the clear necessarily, I would say.
Yeah. Um, well, before we go to the break, I'm just curious. We want to get to the tech stuff, of course, but I'm curious what inspired you to start writing about this stuff. Are you a smoker? Do you have smokers in your family, or was it just an interesting business story for you?
So I'm not a smoker. I definitely smoked back in the day
Hmm.
when I was a teen. And my grandfather died of lung cancer from smoking, a lifetime of
Hmm.
smoking. But for me, it was more a business story more than anything. It was a
Yeah.
fascinating business story about, Silicon Valley company taking on this very notorious industry that struck me as one of the most interesting business stories I've ever written about. So that
Hmm.
was largely what drew me to it. But certainly I had some kind of like personal interest in the story as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, one of the things that I thought about as I was reading was, in high school, of course, I mean, maybe not of course, but it seemed natural to me to try cigarettes, and I
Yeah.
did. And I
Hmm.
would probably still be smoking cigarettes today. And if I was juuling, I'm sure I would be like a Juul addict at this point. But I got lucky and just had a bad experience. I think I got my hands on a pack of like really low quality cigarettes, and then lit them off a friend's stove, and then just chain smoked like 4 or 5 in a row. Threw up for like 4 hours, and that was the end of cigarettes for me. But without that,
Yeah.
and if I had like this like pretty easy device that delivers a nice hit of nicotine, and you could smoke the equivalent of a pack of cigarettes in an afternoon without feeling what I felt, I'm sure I would be addicted to that stuff.
Well, and that's a thing. And like they came in these cool flavors. Like
Hmm.
what teen wouldn't want to inhale gummy bears? I mean,
Yeah.
it's a very attractive kind of product. And then it was like really cool and flashy. And we'll get into the tech and stuff like that. But right, I think
Hmm.
it's important to note to underscore what you said is that a single pod of Juul contains as much nicotine as a pack of cigarettes. And
Hmm.
there's no on or off switch. There's no like, you light the cigarette, the ash, you put it out, it's done. Like you can just keep inhaling all of this nicotine. You just reload the pod, and you don't have to go anywhere. You don't have to step outside. Nobody's like, "Oh, you stink." Like it's it's really ideal.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's get into the tech stuff right after the break. Because everyone says, Juul's a tech company, but are they really? All right. We'll be back with Lauren Etter right after this. And we are back here on the Big Technology Podcast with Lauren Etter, the author of The Devil's Playbook. It's a great book about Juul. We've been talking about the rise and fall of Juul. Let's talk about the technology aspect, really dig into that. So, Lauren, I mean, is Juul a tech company? Because they do seem like electronics company, and they sell vapes. They're not exactly like software savants. They're not building iPhones, which has hardware and software inside. So we talk about them as, a tech company in Silicon Valley. They obviously set up shop in San Francisco. I always found it weird that like their headquarters were just a few blocks away from our headquarters when I was working at BuzzFeed, and they're still not too far away from me here in San Francisco. So I'm curious what you think about the distinction. Do they really deserve to be a tech company? Because everybody wants to call themselves a tech company these days.
I mean, it's interesting. Like, is Tesla a tech company? Like, I feel like they are a tech company. They
Tesla, I
innovated,
would say, yeah, most definitely, yeah. But let's
right?
hear about Juul. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I guess the reason that I bring up that
Hmm.
comparison is because I think it's interesting that, you know, it took Silicon Valley to innovate on Detroit, right? Like, the innovation did not come from, GM or Ford initially. Well, go back. But anyway, the real innovation didn't come from there. It came from Silicon Valley. And I think it's the same with Juul. Like, I do think they're a tech company. I mean, as much as Juul would like to distance themselves now from their tech company roots and from the kind of Silicon Valley roots, I I think they are. I mean, they solved a problem, attempted to solve a problem, innovated on an old school market, brought to bear technology. They're certainly a hardware company, um, and yeah, I do think I would definitely call them a tech company for sure.
Hmm. I mean, one of the things that I think distinguishes them is that they did take VC money.
Yes.
And when you take venture capital money, that changes everything because rather than being like an old school business that sort of built, you all of a sudden have some serious growth expectations. And
Yes.
you have to justify because VCs look for 10, 20x returns, and anything else is sort of considered a failure. And I'm curious from your perspective, how did taking that VC money change what Juul ended up, what Juul could have been, and then what it ended up becoming?
You know, when I think about Juul and what the company could have been and how they could have solved this real problem of smokers and the smoking epidemic, I really do believe that taking the tech money and, kind of fashioning themselves as a tech company was, in a way, their demise, because
Hmm.
it did put so much pressure on them to meet those metrics. Like, one person kind of close to the company said it was like we suddenly had a gun at our backs and we had to run.
Hmm.
Like, you have to, once you take the money, you have to basically figure out how to scale and to continue to justify the investment. And so that's exactly what they did. They took the money, they figured out how to scale, and they hired the wrong people. They
Hmm.
hired people from Silicon Valley who, and this was kind of in their DNA, but they hired people who decided to scale the product as fast as possible to create a return on their investment and to scale the company, and who were concerned first and foremost with marketing the product and getting it out there as fast as possible. And I really do think that that was a pain point for them. That was a point where they could have done the business differently. There were multiple options. It just would not have been a monster growth company, right? So, yes, I think that, by fashioning themselves as a tech company, taking the VC money, kind of plugging into that entire ecosystem, put them in a situation where they had to scale very quickly, and scaling for them meant getting a highly addictive nicotine product into as many hands as possible. Um, and I think that ended up being problematic for them, and they're paying for it dramatically right now.
Right. And just to hang on to one word that you said, the highly addictive part of it. So these devices were delivering 5% nicotine. What is
Yes.
that? How does that compare to like a regular cigarette?
It's not an exact comparison because people
Hmm.
smoke differently. Some people smoke slower. Some people don't plug holes on the filter. There's people
Hmm.
smoking habits. But the best comparison is that it is uh, one pod. I think the easiest comparison is what I've already said, which is the
Pod
one
is a
pod
pack.
equals a pack of
Yeah.
cigarettes.
Yeah. But the
But
point is
but
that,
the other
yeah.
sorry, the other comparison that's, I think,
Hmm.
really useful is that at the time when Juul came on the market, no other e-cigarette was 5%. Like, the
Right.
earlier competitors were like 2% at best, maybe
Hmm.
3%. It was the most highly addictive nicotine e-cigarette on the market by far.
Right. And you couldn't even, if you wanted to get a less concentrated nicotine pod from them, you couldn't get it.
Correct.
So Yeah. So I think they did that, and then of course the marketing to kids, right? Because they knew that was going to give them the big market, and that had a chance to blow up due to virality. So it seems like those decisions are what are basically a factor of this money.
Right. So this is one of the most contentious issues right now. And this is, the attorneys general are going to be litigating this. It's like a
Mm-hmm.
very hotly debated issue right now that has like very high stakes kind of legal ramifications, whether or not Juul actually intended to market to kids.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, when they created their first marketing campaign, they designed a campaign that seemed pretty cool, and seemed like a very sexy, kind of flashy, using bright colors, using super hot models.
Yeah.
And,
Not only that, they were talking about how internally, I think you have this detail in the book, they were talking about how the models looked young, and they were happy about that.
yeah, that's going to be probably introduced in litigation. The fact that they were talking about the youngness of the
That's
models.
crazy to me. It's like anyway, sorry, go ahead. But I don't
Well,
know how
but
you do that. Yeah.
for Juul, to kind of
Mm-hmm.
play devil's advocate, or to come to Juul's defense a little
Mm-hmm.
bit, like, they did talk about how we should get models who look, older, or we should get models. They talked about it. And I think that's going to actually be potentially problematic for them because they are aware of it. But they
Mm-hmm.
did say, let's try to get models who are at least like 25 or older, so they don't
Yeah.
seem like they're young. But like,
But
how do you
I've worked
market?
in marketing. Like you don't get something out the door unless you go through like 50 rounds of approvals. It's not
Oh,
like
no, they
some rogue
had, yes,
marketer is going to go
no.
out and say bam, and then you're going to, you refine the message, and by the time something gets out the door, everyone signed off on it.
100%. And Juul was unique because the board of directors was extremely hands-on. This was
Mm.
not a board that met occasionally to kind of like check numbers and make sure like things weren't going off the rails.
Yeah, they
This
were
was a
living in the
board that was,
offices.
yes, and they were extremely involved, and they absolutely saw the marketing campaign and signed off on it. And so yeah, but they were, their mindset was, okay, let's create a product that's cool and that people are going to like and that people are going to use. And how do you market a product to a 25-year-old that's not cool to an 18-year-old? It's a very kind of difficult marketing kind of line to walk. And yeah, I mean, I think that getting back to tech, they relied heavily on social media. you know,
Mm-hmm.
Juul was everywhere. It was on Instagram. It was on Twitter. It was on Facebook. It was, they had these splashy parties that they threw in the Hamptons, and, they showed up at music festivals. And so, of course, they marketed their product to be cool, and they immediately got backlash and tried to kind of correct. But the genie was out of the bottle.
Yeah.
Just like, with social media, once something goes viral, you can't take it back. You can't be like, oh, I wish I didn't send that tweet, or oh, I wish I,
Mm-hmm.
hadn't done that. I mean,
A lot of
the
people find that out the hard way.
right.
Yeah.
Yes, the genie was out of the bottle, and their product was out there. And again, getting back, the danger of having a viral product that is also addictive is that there's a snowball effect. People want more of it, and they can continue to come back for it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's partly the genius of the business model too, right? Is like, it's not like a razor blade. They kind of built their model like similar to like Gillette or something like that, but razor blades aren't addictive.
Right,
Like, yeah,
because
you're going to need
you
to,
want to buy the refills, but you don't
yes,
get
you're going to
addicted
buy
to
the refills.
shaving. You might
Right.
like it,
Although,
but
right.
you're not going to
And you
have a
might need to
chemical
shave.
need for a smooth face. So,
Correct. Correct. So I really think that it was their entire business model was flawed. They
mm,
could have like gone the slow route where they, sought approval from the FDA to sell it as a therapeutic device that treated nicotine addiction, or they could, or smoke cigarette addiction rather. They could have, marketed it to adults, truly marketed it to older smokers, and they just didn't. I think it gets back to your question about, is this a tech company? They had the pressure of Silicon Valley. And then
the
once the
VC money in particular, which demanded those
yes,
returns. And
the
I
VC
view this
money.
thing as such a tragedy. Honestly, I view the Jewel story as a tragedy, because as I read your book, I learned so much about the industry, and I learned about how Like we spoke about at the top, the damage is through the burning of the cigarettes. And this is actually a real harm reduction tactic that can be used and can help people. And Juul had that opportunity, through the design and through all the brilliant scientists they brought in to help engineer the product just right. And they could have been, who knows what will happen to them in the future, but they could have been this great respected business that had a massive market just marketing to the people smoking cigarettes already who are looking for an alternative. And in fact, people in the book, you were talking about how employees started reaching for the Juul instead of their cigarettes in the early stage. So it did have that replacement capability. But it was this drive to just get so big, growth at all costs. We hear that all the time out here in Silicon Valley. And that ended up turning this thing into, you wrote it right in the title, the devil. When you start hooking kids on this stuff, in pursuit of growth at all costs, and delivering so much nicotine, it becomes impossible to put down. It's a big issue. So I don't know what you think about it, but I view it as a tragedy for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think so too. And I don't want to speak for the founders at all, but I believe that,
you can. We won't penalize you on this one.
Yeah,
No,
I mean, I do.
Yeah.
I do think that they really intended initially to solve that problem, and I think that they just got put into the meat grinder. I think that the Silicon Valley meat grinder, I think that they and I think the other thing that we haven't really talked about is at the time there was actually a lot of competition.
Mm-hmm.
So not only did they take VC money, but they had humongous competition from the cigarette companies. Like Reynolds had created this product called Views. Altria, of course, had created this product called Mark 10. Like they're about to get squashed by the 500-pound gorilla, So like they had to be scrappy and to like figure out how to compete and to out innovate. Now, those companies were not innovative, which is, why Altria ended up like basically crawling to them and saying, here, take my $12.8 billion. But like, they really did have to like, if there was this moment in time where they were like, it's basically live or die. Like we either compete or we're like out of this market immediately. So there's huge competition aside from the VC money that I think really kind of pressured them to, take on this growth at all costs model.
But at the end of the day, we're all our decisions. And I've given the VCs a hard time here so far, and they deservedly so. The people that decided to invest, it's not just a problem here with Juul, it's a problem all over the tech industry. And of course, sometimes it leads to amazing, life-changing things. And without it, we probably wouldn't have some great companies. But we know the downside of it, which is that sometimes companies go nuts, and they do. It's part of the ethos to bend the law, sometimes break the law. Look at Uber. Juul is another example. They're all over the place. Look at what's happening with Facebook in order to grow. And so, the VCs definitely have the blame, but also like I don't know if I can let these founders off the hook. Like you are the choices that you make, and at the end of the day, and even though they were in this meat grinder, they definitely made the choices, and they knew what they were doing, at least from my perspective.
No, I think so, and I think they just kind of got like topsy-turvy. It's like they had this idea to create this product, and then just it took off so fast. I think it just took off so fast, and there was just like a cannon filled with money that was like being blasted at them. And I think I think another kind of lesson is that in Silicon Valley, you really need to surround yourself with ethical people. With people who are making ethical decisions. You need to have your moral compass like really straight. And I think that their moral compass was off.
Yeah, you had an employee who was like asking himself before he took a job there, like whether he was the banality of evil by going to work for a company like this. And then he goes and works for them and then ends up regretting not staying on when they ended up selling a good chunk of their company to Altria. Which is what used to be Philip Morris. And it's like, wait, you were worried about being the banality of evil. Now you're kicking yourself for not taking the money from the tobacco company. It is. So of course, like, it's this push and pull. It's the system and then it's the individual. And, people do make these choices. I guess like who's responsible for it? I don't know. But people do make choices at the end of the day, and they got to live with them and they got to own up to it. My perspective.
Right. Right. But like a lot of it was when, as Juul was recruiting employees, it was the story, right? And again, back to Silicon Valley, and every company has its story about, how it's going to change the world and how it's going to solve this problem that nobody else can solve. And Juul's story was that it was solving the smoking problem. And I think that a lot of employees were kind of seduced by that. They liked the idea of going to work for a company that hadn't gone public yet, that had a lot of upside, potential upside. And yeah, so yeah, I think everybody kind of convinced themselves that they actually weren't working for the tobacco industry, right? Because at the time they really weren't, but they were in the tobacco space. But yeah, I think as I say in my book, there was this moment when Altria invests $12.8 billion where the glass shattered, where everybody was like, "Oh shit!" Like, we kind of told ourselves for a while that we were the underdog, that we were,
Now
out
we
to,
work for big tobacco.
yeah, now we work for big tobacco. So, and I think that the founders kind of struggled with that too. It's like, oh, wow, okay, we were supposed to take on big tobacco. Now suddenly we are big tobacco, and it's gone in an, entirely different direction. It's basically being subsumed by big tobacco.
Yeah. And now we talk a lot about the regulations also. We might have touched about this earlier, but aren't the people that pick up these things making a choice for themselves to start smoking them? So maybe the government shouldn't intervene. What do you think about that argument?
Well, I 100% agree with that argument when it comes to adults. Like, no questions asked. Like, you want to use nicotine for the rest of your life? Go for it. Enjoy it. Great. Have fun with that. And reap the consequences if there are them. But like for kids, I think it's just a different equation. It's like for kids, and then, people will say, well, it's up to the retailers to police that. They shouldn't be selling to underage kids and stuff like that. But, for a while there were not very many barriers for the kids to getting the products and stuff like that. So I don't really think that argument applies for young people. Like
Yeah.
they're teens, like their brains aren't fully developed. Like,
Hmm.
yeah, they're probably going to end up doing something. Maybe some of them will end up doing something bad, smoking cigarettes or, smoking pot or drinking alcohol or whatever. But it's when you have that kind of the risk factor that's there with the highly addictive product combined with the marketing that appears to be targeting the kids. I think that's the problem. And I think that's really the problem for Juul. Had they
Yeah.
not gotten the kids addicted, I don't think people really would have
It
cared
wouldn't have
as
been.
much. It
Yeah.
wouldn't have been a big deal. I think
Right.
they would have had that more heroic veneer, honestly.
Hmm.
It was they stepped on the third rail of American culture. I mean, like we went through the tobacco wars where like, whatever, almost 30% of teens were smoking. And it was,
Right. And
you
tobacco, they
know,
were explicitly marketing to kids.
oh,
They
100%.
had Joe
Oh my
Camel
God.
backpacks. Yeah.
No, there's no, I mean, nobody
Hmm.
even, it's not even up for argument. I
Right.
mean, there were internal memos talking about how to attract the next generation. They called them their
Replacement customers. It's
the,
unbelievable. Well, who are they replacing? Oh yeah, the people, the 400,000 or 500,000 people that products
that
killed
died,
in a
that died.
year.
They literally
Unbelievable.
called them the
Yeah.
replacement customers.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's the problem.
That. Yeah.
That's the problem with hooking up with the tobacco
Hmm.
industry is like you're
Hmm.
hooking up with like the most like, this industry that has been discredited, that has been just continually untrustworthy. And it's hard for people to separate that out. I think Juul has a
Yeah.
real uphill battle,
Yeah.
honestly.
And I want to get to some more regulation stuff in a minute, but
Yeah.
one question before we go to our second break, which is how important was social media in spreading this thing to kids, and do the social media companies bear some responsibility? I mean,
Oh,
I am
yes.
reticent to call for social media companies to censor stuff because we know where that goes. Like this whole for a long time, you weren't allowed to mention the possibility that coronavirus could have come from a lab on Facebook. And then now you can because they're now open to it. So they're obviously not very good at, monitoring what we can and can't say. But on the other hand, when it comes to kids' health, maybe that is something they should step in. So I'm kind of curious, like what you think their responsibility is there.
Well, that was really interesting, actually. Like, I think the social media companies have kind of dodged a bullet on this one in a
Hmm.
way. Like, they bear a lot of responsibility. Like, to be fair to Juul, after their initial campaign, the vaporized campaign that was like, oh my God, clearly targeting at least youngish people, they kind of tried to pull back, and then they started dialing back on social media. But like by that time, the product was already out there. And there were all of these creators on social media that would like, I write about this guy who created the
Yeah.
Juul Nation account, and like
Making
he was on
thousands a
Instagram.
month.
Yes. And,
Mhm.
you had these people who had figured out how to monetize it on social media. And Juul would actually like beg Instagram, please take down this account. Like, and the social media companies wouldn't do anything about it. They're not violating any of our rules. Like, there's nothing we can do about it. And like also eBay, I feel like eBay has gotten off the hook
Mhm.
too. Like eBay was allowing them to like, anybody to essentially buy Juul, even after they tried to age gate the product more strictly. Like you could still go to eBay and buy some Juul pods and stuff like that. So like,
Yeah,
I absolutely think, whether or not they should have censored Juul, that's a whole other conversation. But like, I absolutely think that the social media companies bear a lot of culpability and really kind of dodge a bullet on this whole like youth addiction
mhm.
issue, because a lot of it was on social media,
Totally.
100%.
And there's the right to say something, and then there's a totally separate question about whether algorithms should spread it. And the people that you write about in the book, they got engagement. The algorithm spread it. It wasn't paid for. It
Yeah.
wasn't organic. It was organic, that it wasn't paid for, but it wasn't, people going directly to their page. It was the algorithm saying, hey, this is an engaging thing and we should show it to more people. And actually, I even looked today, and hashtag Juul Boys is still populated with some young looking people
Yeah.
juuling it up.
Wow.
So if you work at
Yeah.
Facebook and are thinking about this, I'd love to hear from you about it, because it does seem like an issue you should reckon with. All right, let's take a break. I want to talk a little bit about the regulatory aspect here, more broadly from like a technology standpoint. So we'll break and come right back for one last segment. And we're back here for our final segment with Lauren Etter, author of The Devil's Playbook and also a reporter at Bloomberg News. Book is great. You should buy it, especially if you're already here in mid in the 40s in the conversation. You'll like the book, I promise you. Okay, so like the regulation aspect, it's kind of interesting to me because one thing that I've seen, when it comes to social media companies in particular, but tech companies in general, is that the tech moves so fast that a lot of times the damage is done before Congress or the regulatory bodies can, even get their heads around what's happening. It seems like part of that happened here, but they also moved pretty fast. So I'm curious what you think about this inside the tech industry and how it's played out with Juul in particular.
Yeah. No, it's interesting that you characterize it as playing out really fast, because actually I think it like they dragged their feet for years. Like
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm
really.
coming at it from the perspective of like what's going on with the big tech companies. And what
Oh,
we
yeah.
see with them is Congress drags them in front of hearings, makes YouTube
Yes.
moments, and then
Yeah.
doesn't do jack shit. So actually, they acted here, and to me, that was. But I guess like when you're addicting millions of kids to e-cigarettes, it's fairly slow. It's a couple of years. But sorry, go
Yeah.
ahead. I didn't mean to
No,
interrupt
I
you.
mean,
Yeah.
I think we're on the same page. The point, the important point though, is that Juul was able to exploit a regulatory gap. So essentially, Congress did not act fast enough to bring e-cigarettes under their regulatory structure for tobacco products. So in 2009, the FDA was allowed finally to regulate tobacco products. But in that law, they didn't stipulate that e-cigarettes were a tobacco product.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't until 2016 that Congress finally deemed e-cigarettes to be considered a tobacco product. From 2009 to 2016, e-cigarettes were kind of still already out there, and they were basically no regulations whatsoever. So Juul launches in 2015, takes advantage of this existing regulatory gap and knows that the gap is going to be closed. That's really interesting to me, is that Juul knew that the regulations were coming. And that was also part of, we've talked about, the pressure from the VCs and the, existing competition from the tobacco industry. But there is also this impending regulatory structure that was getting ready to basically close the curtain, as people call it. The curtain fell.
Mm-hmm.
And so basically Juul was incentivized to act really fast to get their product out there as fast as possible before the regulations kicked in. So yeah, so
And that's when
once.
they start shipping out all these wacky flavors because they're like,
Totally.
we're not going to have a chance to do this afterwards.
Yes. It's like Bird, like being like, oh shit, the city's gonna the city's going to like regulate scooters, but let's just like
Hmm.
dump scooters on every street corner as fast as possible so we can, or like Uber doing the same thing. Like it was a similar kind of race between regulators and the
Hmm.
company. So yeah, so finally the regulations do come down, and they're still sort of in flux, but yeah, they took flavors off the market. They implemented age requirements, that type of thing. So now there's basically, they do have some sort of regulatory structure, but there's going to be more. The FDA is essentially in the process right now as we speak, evaluating whether or not Juul will meet this public health standard and whether or not they're going to be able to remain in the market. So the FDA
Hmm.
has another few months to decide whether or not Juul will be able to remain on the market. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah.
By the way, there are like these negative consequences that we see with regulation and second order effects. Like when they said we're going to put these rules into place, then you see these companies scrambling to get everything on the market. Uh, and even when I was reading, I found it was really interesting that the master settlement agreement with big tobacco companies, after they had agreed to reform their businesses in order to reduce the harm on the public, they had agreed to essentially make all their documents public. And yeah, that's great from a public accountability standpoint, but also it ended up, I don't know where Juul would be without those documents, because the company's founders ended up combing through them and all the competitors ended up combing through it. And they essentially had, maybe that's what it is, the playbook, right,
Oh,
right
totally.
there, because of the regulation that we've done. So I just make this point to say that oftentimes people say that regulation is simple and X outcome will inevitably be good if X regulator does this, but it's complicated stuff that can have all these second order effects that aren't immediately apparent and don't get summed up in catchy headlines.
Yes, and I think in this instance, the most important effect is that if these products aren't allowed on the market anymore, smokers, legitimate adult
Hmm.
smokers who are essentially have confined themselves to a death sentence, they
Hmm.
don't have the opportunity to access a product that's potentially safer than a cigarette like Juul.
Yeah,
So there are super
it's
like
a
large
balance.
consequences. It's a balance. And I think that the regulators, the FDA in particular, has a very tough balance to strike, and they're under a lot of pressure from all sides. Um, I can't imagine the FDA taking this product off the market. I think
Hmm.
that, they'd be sued. I think that there would be huge blowback, political blowback. Um, so yeah, this is an industry that is truly at an inflection point right now. And it'll be very interesting to see which way it goes.
Weird question, but we've talked a lot critically about the company, but do you think that? Well, I mean, obviously the damage has been done in some way, but if they do end up getting all these adults that, like as you mentioned, are hooked on cigarettes and have basically created a death sentence for them, and it does turn out that this stuff is safer, then it seems like it's safer, at least. Can Juul one day be a good thing for society?
Yeah, I mean, I think if Juul can thread the needle, uh, which is essentially excluding the next generation off from nicotine addiction while treating adult smokers, that they can.
Hmm.
But I had this very interesting conversation with Mike Moore, who is, the former attorney general who, really brought this one of the first tobacco lawsuits and was super consequential. He essentially said these companies exist solely because they've gotten people addicted to nicotine. And
Hmm.
if you can't convince people to pay money to inhale something into their lungs, then you don't have a business anymore. And
Hmm.
like, if you think about it, if this industry doesn't have a next generation of users, there's not a very like long tail on the industry, right? It's going to peter
Yeah.
out eventually. So there's this huge, fascinating kind of business incentive for them to continue hooking users. But at the same time, they say, no, it's just for adult smokers. So I
Mm.
think if Juul can truly be a solution for adult smokers and adult smokers only, and not lead to initiation of either youth or non nicotine users, then it's probably a pretty good product. but when you
There's a big
think
but there. Yeah.
there's a big but,
Yeah.
because what company wants to be in business for a single generation? No company talks
Hmm.
about it like that. You
Right.
talk about multi generations. How do you build a business not just for one generation but multiple generations?
Hmm.
And if they're true to their word that they want to, be a product for current smokers, then they have there's a finite kind of element to their business, but everybody knows that they're going to get new users, whether or not those
Right.
are teen smokers, perhaps, whether or not those are just kids who want to try nicotine.
Hmm.
I mean, I think we're always going to have nicotine users. But yeah, I think it opens up a lot of interesting questions. But if Juul can be true to its stated mission of getting adult smokers off of cigarettes, smoking cigarettes, then it could be a okay business.
Yeah. And I asked that question because I was tweeting out the end of your book, which I thought
Right.
was great, talking about they didn't need to get, basically, it was saying what we talked about. They
Yeah.
didn't need to try to get this big, and they could have been this force for good that they hoped for in the beginning. And, someone tweeted back, what about the utilitarian argument? And it's like, all right, well, it's still in play. It's just kind of far fetched. It
And
seems
what is the
like
utilitarian argument?
it's basically like will it take people who smoke cigarettes and end up turning them on to e-cigarettes? Essentially, we've been talking about it. So
Yeah.
TBD,
Yeah.
TBD, but not looking
TBD.
good. What have they felt about the book? Have they contacted you, or have you gotten a chance to speak with the founders? Because I didn't see any
So,
direct quotes from them in the book. So,
right, right. Yeah. So what I'll say is that I've heard a lot of feedback from Richmond, which is very interesting. Richmond is where Altria is based. That's the
mm,
hometown of the tobacco industry, and I know that there's a lot of interest there. And I've gotten some interesting feedback and stuff like that. But so far, yeah, it's so far pretty interesting. But I'll leave it at that.
okay, they're not threatening to sue you or anything like that.
No,
Yeah,
no,
it's
and I
it's
don't. I
a
really don't
yeah
see why.
yeah.
It's like there are lots of haters out there, people
Hmm.
who think that I'm like some sort of anti-vaping person, but I feel like it's like a pretty nuanced look at this
Right.
complicated, super controversial industry, and if they read my book, then they'll realize that. But I don't think that I don't see a lawsuit. I just don't.
Yeah. Last thing I want to end with is there's a scene at the beginning of the book where the two Juul founders go into Altria, which again is the rebranded Philip Morris. Come on, guys, stick with the name. Own what you've done. But
Right.
okay, Altria. They go into Altria and they try to sell the product to them or try to get investment, and they get laughed out of the room. And they were all gung ho, we're going to destroy big tobacco. Then a number of years later, they end up selling 35%, I believe,
Yeah.
of the company to
Correct.
Altria for somewhere around $13 billion.
Yeah.
A price tag so big that Altria had to lay off a number of people in its traditional businesses, and
Hmm.
it tanked the stock. And then they had to write either they've written down their investment or they don't believe that it's worth anywhere close to what they paid for. So, in some sense, they actually did stick it to big tobacco, but not exactly in the path that they hoped for.
I I thought the exact same thing. It was like they're saying they're going to take big tobacco down, and I think there's even a quote in my book where they're like, we just punked this 100-year-old company, cigarette company. And I mean, it was a deal of the century for Juul and the
Mm,
Juul board. I mean, they didn't even have to sell stock. They just got a dividend. They got a $12.8 billion dividend
mm.
and got to continue holding all of their shares, and basically just took all of that money off the table. So, they did distribute some of it to the employees, but the vast majority of it went into the pockets of the original founders and the biggest shareholders. So, yeah, in a way, they did stick it to big tobacco. I agree with you. I like
Right.
that.
And they were so worried that the employees wouldn't come along for the ride that they had to put aside $1 billion or so and distribute it among the employees, who walked away
Yes.
with what, minimum of $600,000, but often million or more.
Exactly.
It's amazing what money
Yeah.
will do. It's
Oh,
amazing what
totally. It
money
was
will do. They
definitely
had,
cleared
yeah.
their conscience a little bit, for sure. Made it a little bit,
Hmm.
made the sugar, the medicine go down, sugar like the medicine go
Yeah.
down. So yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
And I read that scene of the employees at Altria hearing the news that they were going to get laid off, and lots of them were going to get laid off as part of this $600 million cost-cutting effort in order to bring Juul in. And I did feel bad a little bit, but not too much. I'm going to be honest.
I felt like that was one of the most kind of jarring scenes, was
Mm-hmm.
like the fact that that happened on the same day. Like
Yep.
one company in Silicon Valley is getting like money rained down on them. And the same day, across on the other side of the country in Richmond, they're being delivered the news that they're going to be layoffs. And it was a much different tone. It was like one was celebrating, the other was very somber, almost like a funeral procession. So, yeah, but that's the collision of these two industries. It's just there are winners and there are losers in multiple different realms, I guess, in this story.
Yeah, it's what disruption looks like, except this is a
Yeah.
very unique story of disruption. The book is Devil's Playbook by Lauren Etter. Lauren, thank you for joining so much. It was a pleasure reading the book, and it was great getting a chance to speak with you about it. Thanks for coming on.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun to talk to you, Alex.
Likewise. And thanks everybody for listening. Thank you, Nick Gottlieb, for turning this around on short notice as usual. And with the editing, of course, mastering, and Red Circle for selling the ads and hosting the show. We always appreciate that. We will be back next Wednesday with another show with a tech insider, outside agitator, or journalist. We'll keep you waiting in suspense for which one it will be. Thanks again for Lauren. Pick up the book, Devil's Playbook. It's out and available at all major booksellers today. All right, we'll see you next time.